Hey there. Before we jump into today's incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a big thumbs up if you love jaw-dropping, inspiring tales that leave you speechless. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring you even more amazing stories. Now sit back, relax, and let's get started. On a quiet afternoon at San Francisco International Airport, a man named Jonathan Harris walked into the lounge at Gate 17. Jonathan was not the kind of person who attracted attention. He wore a simple but well-tailored suit with no flashy watches or extravagant accessories. Yet behind this unassuming appearance was one of the world's wealthiest individuals, known for his visionary leadership of groundbreaking tech companies and daring investment ventures. Jonathan had always lived in quiet confidence. He never felt the need to flaunt his wealth because to him, true power lay not in appearances, but in the ability to control situations. That day, he was preparing to board a flight to Tokyo for an important meeting with business partners. Everything seemed like just another ordinary day until he crossed paths with Rebecca, the lead flight attendant. Rebecca had been with the airline for 6 years. She was diligent, detail-oriented, and took great pride in doing her job by the book. However, this particular day had been grueling. Delayed flights, impatient passengers, and a packed schedule had pushed her patience to its limits. As she approached Jonathan's row, she noticed him engrossed in a file on his tablet. "Sir, please turn off your device and switch it to airplane mode," Rebecca said in a calm but firm voice. Jonathan, absorbed in his reading, didn't immediately register her request. He looked up after a moment, smiled, and nodded, intending to comply. But Rebecca, already on edge, mistook his delayed response as defiance. "Sir, I need you to comply with the rules," she repeated, her tone sharper this time. Jonathan looked at her with his characteristic calm, offering no resistance. "I apologize, I'll turn it off now," he said politely. But for Rebecca, his composed demeanor felt dismissive. Frustrated, she decided to escalate the situation. "Sir, if you don't cooperate immediately, I'll have to ask you to leave the plane." Jonathan couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had traveled the world for business, yet no one had ever spoken to him like this. Still, he wasn't one to make a scene. Quietly, he rose from his seat, grabbed his belongings, and exited the plane without protest. The other passengers watched in stunned silence, unsure of what had just unfolded. Minutes later, as Jonathan sat in the airport lounge processing the incident, it became clear to him that this was more than just a personal inconvenience. What had happened was a glaring reminder of how small actions could have big consequences. But Jonathan wasn't one to let setbacks define him. What he decided to do next would not only reshape the airline's future, but also deliver a profound message about respect, power, and the choices we make when faced with adversity. As Jonathan Harris sat in the terminal, the faint hum of airport announcements echoed through the crowded space. The steady stream of passengers, dragging suitcases and clutching boarding passes, seemed to blur together in his peripheral vision. Normally, Jonathan would have found solace in this kind of anonymity. For someone as wealthy and influential as him, it was a rare luxury to move unnoticed. But today, something was different. Today, he couldn't shake the sting of what had just happened. He glanced down at the tablet in his hands, the same device that had sparked the confrontation. The flight attendant's stern tone still rang in his ears, her words cutting deeper than they should have. Jonathan wasn't a man who held grudges, but this wasn't about a delayed flight or an overworked employee. This was about respect, or the lack of it. His phone vibrated, pulling him out of his thoughts. The name on the screen read Gregory Shaw. Gregory wasn't just his lawyer. He was Jonathan's closest advisor, the man who had been by his side through every major acquisition, merger, and battle. "Gregory," Jonathan said, answering the call. "Jonathan, I just got word about what happened," Gregory replied, his voice as calm and measured as always. "Do you want me to handle this?" Jonathan sighed, his gaze drifting to the bustling runway outside the window. "No," he said after a pause. "This one's personal." Gregory hesitated. "Personal? That's not like you. Usually you let these things slide." "This is different," Jonathan replied, his voice firm. "It's not about the inconvenience. It's the principle." People like her think they can treat others however they want, because they have a little authority. They forget who they're dealing with. Gregory chuckled lightly. Fair enough. What's the plan? Jonathan leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk forming on his lips. We're buying the airline. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Gregory, unflappable as ever, responded without missing a beat. All right. How fast do you want this done? Yesterday, Jonathan replied. Pull the team together. Contact the M&A group. I want every detail about their financials on my desk by the time I get back to the office. Understood, Gregory said, his tone shifting to one of focus and urgency. I'll have the team start digging, but you realize this is going to ruffle some feathers. The board won't roll over easily, and the press will eat this up. I'm counting on it, Jonathan said. Make sure they know this isn't a negotiation. They can either sell, or they can watch their stock prices plummet. Gregory's voice softened slightly. Are you sure about this, Jonathan? You've never been one to act out of anger. Jonathan's expression hardened. This isn't anger, Gregory. This is strategy. If someone disrespects you in public, you don't just walk away. You make sure they, and everyone else, understand that it's a mistake they can't afford to make again. Gregory didn't argue. He knew Jonathan well enough to recognize when his mind was made up. I'll get started. Expect a call in a few hours. Good, Jonathan said, ending the call. As Jonathan sat in the terminal, he began to mentally map out his next moves. He wasn't just a billionaire with money to burn. He was a strategist, a man who thrived on calculated risks and high-stakes decisions. This was no different. The airline had embarrassed him publicly, and now they would learn the cost of underestimating him. By the time Jonathan arrived back at his Manhattan office, Gregory and the team were already in full swing. The sleek, glass-walled conference room buzzed with activity. Laptops clicked, documents were shuffled, and voices murmured as the team pieced together the financial puzzle of the airline. Jonathan, Gregory said, standing as he entered the room, here's what we've got so far. Gregory handed him a thick folder, its contents neatly organized. Jonathan flipped through it, scanning charts, profit margins, and market analysis. The airline wasn't in bad shape, but it wasn't thriving either. Years of mismanagement and outdated policies had left it vulnerable, a weakness Jonathan intended to exploit. They've been struggling to maintain market share, Gregory explained. Their competitors are eating into their international roots, and customer satisfaction is at an all-time low. If we move quickly, we can catch them off guard. Jonathan nodded, his mind already racing. What about the board? Who are the key players? Gregory pulled up a slide on the conference room screen. The CEO, Marcus Lang, has been in the role for 5 years. He's a numbers guy, but not much of a visionary. The rest of the board is a mix of old-school industry veterans and newer members brought in to modernize the company. They're fractured, easy to divide. Jonathan's lips curled into a faint smile. Good, let's use that. Prepare an offer that's too generous for the shareholders to ignore, and make sure the board knows that if they resist, I'm prepared to take this hostile. Gregory raised an eyebrow. You're not holding back, are you? Jonathan shook his head. Why should I? This isn't just about acquiring an airline. It's about sending a message. If you disrespect me, there are consequences. Over the next 24 hours, Jonathan's team worked around the clock. Lawyers drafted proposals, financial analysts ran projections, and PR consultants prepared statements. Jonathan, meanwhile, stayed focused on the bigger picture. He wasn't just taking over an airline, he was reshaping its future. By the next morning, the offer was ready. It was a bold move, a premium price for the airline's shares that would leave the board with little room to argue. Gregory had ensured the offer came with a clear ultimatum: accept or face a public battle they couldn't win. Jonathan sat in his office, overlooking the Manhattan skyline, as Gregory delivered the final update. The board has been notified. They've called an emergency meeting to discuss the offer. It's only a matter of time now. Jonathan nodded, his expression calm but resolute. And the press? They're already picking up on the story, Gregory said. Once the news breaks, it'll be everywhere. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk on his face. Good, let them watch. Hours later, the board of directors convened in a tense, hastily arranged meeting. Marcus Lang, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, his face pale as he reviewed the offer. The board members murmured among themselves, their voices tinged with anxiety. "This is unexpected," one of them said. "We weren't prepared for this." "It's not just unexpected," Lang replied. "It's a takeover, and if we don't act fast, we'll lose control of the company." As the board debated, Gregory's team monitored their every move. By the time the meeting ended, the writing was on the wall. The board had no choice but to accept. When Gregory called Jonathan with the news, his voice was calm but tinged with satisfaction. "It's done. They've accepted the offer. Congratulations. You now own the airline." Jonathan didn't celebrate. For him, this was never about the victory. It was about the principle. And now that he had the power, it was time to make things right. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. He stood looking out at the city below. The airline had underestimated him, but now they would learn the true meaning of respect. The news broke like wildfire. Billionaire Jonathan Harris launches hostile takeover of major airline, the headlines read. Across financial networks, the story dominated discussions. Industry analysts speculated on Harris's motives. Competitors scrambled to understand his endgame, and social media buzzed with theories. But amidst all the noise, Jonathan remained silent, letting his actions speak louder than any statement could. In the airline's corporate headquarters, chaos reigned. Marcus Lang, the embattled CEO, gathered his senior executives for an emergency meeting. The mood in the room was tense, a mix of panic and defiance. "We need to respond," Lang said, slamming a printed copy of Harris's offer onto the table. "This is nothing short of a declaration of war." One of the executives, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, leaned forward. "We can't match his resources, Marcus. Harris's offer is beyond anything we could counter. If we fight, we risk alienating shareholders and tanking the stock." Lang's jaw tightened. He knew the executive was right. The shareholders wouldn't stand by if the board rejected a lucrative offer just to save face. But the thought of surrendering control to Harris, a man who had blindsided them so completely, was a bitter pill to swallow. "What about the employees?" another executive asked. "If Harris takes over, they'll panic. We need to reassure them." Lang sighed, rubbing his temples. "Draft a memo. Tell them we're exploring all options to protect their interests. But until we have a plan, keep the details vague." Meanwhile, Jonathan's team moved into the final stages of the takeover. Gregory and his associates worked tirelessly, ensuring every legal and financial angle was covered. The offer had been designed to leave no room for negotiation, a calculated move to force the board's hand. As the clock ticked down, Jonathan remained composed. Sitting in his office, he watched the situation unfold in real time. Multiple screens displayed live updates, market reactions, breaking news, and internal reports from his team. Gregory entered the room, holding a stack of documents. "The board is cornered. We've made it clear that any resistance will only harm their shareholders. They know their options are limited." Jonathan nodded, his eyes never leaving the screens. "And the public reaction?" Gregory smirked. "Divided as expected. Some people are calling you ruthless, others think you're a genius." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Let them think what they want. This isn't about public opinion." Gregory hesitated for a moment before asking, "So what is this about, Jonathan? I've seen you close deals before, but this feels personal." Jonathan's gaze finally shifted to Gregory. "It is personal, but not in the way you think. This isn't about revenge. It's about setting a standard. When people see my name, they need to understand that respect isn't optional." Gregory nodded, recognizing the steely determination in Jonathan's voice. "Understood." By the time the board officially accepted Jonathan's offer, the deal had already made waves across the industry. The airline's stock surged as investors reacted to the news, and employees speculated about what the takeover would mean for their future. But for Marcus Lang and his board, the victory felt hollow. They had been outmaneuvered, and now they had no choice but to relinquish control. The first meeting between Jonathan and the airline's leadership was a masterclass in power dynamics. Held in a sleek conference room at Jonathan's headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lang and his executives entered hesitantly, their discomfort evident. Jonathan was already seated at the head of the table, his demeanor calm but commanding. As the executives took their seats, he greeted them with a nod, his piercing gaze making it clear who was in charge. "Gentlemen," Jonathan began, his voice even but firm, "I appreciate you making the time to meet with me today. As you're aware, this is no longer your airline, it's mine." The bluntness of his words hung in the air, leaving the room silent. Lang shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat. "Mr. Harris, Jonathan raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let me save you the trouble, Mr. Lang. I'm not here to rehash the past or debate what went wrong. I'm here to fix it." Lang glanced around the table, his colleagues looking equally uneasy. "We're prepared to assist with the transition," he said cautiously. Jonathan's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Good, because I'm prepared to make some changes, and I expect your full cooperation." He gestured to Gregory, who handed out a stack of documents to the executives. "This is an outline of the restructuring plan. Effective immediately, we'll be streamlining operations, cutting unnecessary costs, and investing in areas that actually matter, like customer service and employee training." The executives exchanged nervous glances as they skimmed the documents. The plan was bold, aggressive, and left little room for debate. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "And let me be clear, mediocrity will not be tolerated. If you're not willing to adapt to this new standard, there's no place for you here." Lang's face paled, but he managed a weak nod. Understood. For Jonathan, the takeover wasn't just about proving a point, it was about creating something better. Over the next few weeks, he immersed himself in the details of the airline's operations. He held meetings with department heads, visited maintenance facilities, and even spent time speaking with frontline employees. His goal was simple: to understand the company from the ground up and rebuild it into something extraordinary. But there was one person he hadn't forgotten: Rebecca, the flight attendant whose actions had sparked this entire chain of events. Jonathan instructed his HR team to locate her personnel file and gather information about her performance history. What he found surprised him. Rebecca wasn't a bad employee. In fact, her record showed she was diligent and hardworking, with consistently positive reviews from passengers. The incident with Jonathan seemed to be an anomaly, likely fueled by stress and exhaustion. Jonathan considered his next move carefully. He could have easily used his newfound power to make an example of Rebecca, but that wasn't his style. Instead, he saw an opportunity to teach a lesson, not just to her, but to everyone watching. Days after the deal was finalized, Jonathan sat in his newly established office at the airline's headquarters. The space was minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a sweeping view of the city skyline. On his desk lay a file marked with a name that had stayed with him since the incident: Rebecca Lane. Jonathan opened the file again, skimming through the notes his HR team had gathered. Rebecca was a dedicated employee, praised for her professionalism and attention to detail. The incident with Jonathan seemed out of character, likely a result of her being overwhelmed. For most people, this might have been a reason to let the matter rest. But Jonathan wasn't most people. He believed in accountability, but also in second chances. He picked up the phone and dialed an internal extension. "Bring Rebecca Lane to my office," he said, "but don't tell her why." Rebecca sat nervously in the lobby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When she had been summoned to meet the new owner of the airline, she had assumed the worst. She replayed the incident on the flight over and over in her mind, regretting every word, every moment of impatience. She had heard rumors about Jonathan Harris, a ruthless businessman, brilliant but unyielding. What would he do to her? "Miss Lane," Jonathan's assistant called. "Mr. Harris will see you now." Rebecca stood, smoothing her uniform as she walked into the office. The room was imposing, and so was the man seated behind the desk. Jonathan looked up, his expression unreadable. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. Rebecca sat, her heart pounding. "Mr. Harris, Jonathan raised a hand, silencing her. "Before you say anything, let me make one thing clear. I didn't ask you here to fire you." Rebecca blinked, startled. That had been her greatest fear. Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze steady. What happened on that flight was unacceptable, not because of what you said to me personally, but because of what it represents. As a flight attendant, you're the face of this airline. Your actions, good or bad, reflect on the entire company. Rebecca nodded, her throat dry. I understand, sir. I take full responsibility for what happened. It was unprofessional, and I deeply regret it. Jonathan studied her in silence, letting the tension build. Finally, he spoke. Do you know what separates a great leader from an average one, Miss Lane? She shook her head, unsure where he was going with this. A great leader, he continued, knows how to manage pressure without letting it affect their judgment. They rise above the chaos, not succumb to it. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. I made a mistake, she said, her voice trembling. I know I did, and I'm truly sorry. If I could take it back, I would. Jonathan's gaze softened just slightly. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the weight of her regret. It reminded him of his own mistakes, moments when his judgment had faltered under pressure. You're lucky, he said finally, because I believe in second chances. Jonathan studied her for a moment before continuing. Regret is a good start, but it's not enough. I believe in learning from mistakes. That's why I've decided to give you a choice. Rebecca's eyes widened. A choice? Jonathan nodded. You can leave this company, no questions asked, with a letter of recommendation for your future endeavors. Or you can stay and work directly with me to improve how this airline treats its employees and passengers. Rebecca stared at him, stunned. She hadn't expected leniency, let alone an opportunity like this. You want me to stay? I don't make empty offers, Miss Lane, Jonathan said. I see potential in you, but potential means nothing if it's not realized. If you choose to stay, you'll be held to the highest standard, just like everyone else. Rebecca didn't hesitate. I'll stay. I want to prove that I can do better. Jonathan nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Good. Let's get to work. The days following Jonathan Harris's transformative meeting with Rebecca Lane were a whirlwind of change, not just for the airline, but for Jonathan himself. What had started as a confrontation born of frustration and principle had evolved into something far greater, a journey of redemption for both Jonathan and Rebecca. Jonathan didn't waste time. He had a vision to turn the airline into not just a profitable business, but a symbol of ethical leadership and innovation. To achieve this, he overhauled the company's values, prioritizing respect, employee well-being, and customer experience. 1. Empowering employees. Jonathan launched a bold initiative, a company-wide mentorship program. Employees like Rebecca, who had previously worked on the front lines, were trained and promoted into leadership roles. The idea was simple. Those who understood the challenges of day-to-day operations would be best suited to lead improvements. Rebecca quickly rose to prominence. Under Jonathan's guidance, she became a key figure in shaping the airline's new culture. She spearheaded a series of workshops aimed at helping employees handle high-stress situations with empathy and professionalism, drawing directly from her own experience with Jonathan. These sessions became legendary within the company and helped employees rediscover their pride in their work. 2. Revolutionizing customer experience. Jonathan believed in putting customers at the heart of the business. He introduced new policies to ensure passengers felt valued. Flight delays were handled with transparency, complaints were resolved swiftly, and small touches, like handwritten notes of appreciation for frequent flyers, brought a personal feel to the airline. 3. Sustainability and innovation. Beyond operations, Jonathan turned his focus to the environment. The airline became one of the first to commit to sustainable practices, investing in eco-friendly aircraft and carbon offset programs. These changes not only improved the airline's image, but also aligned with Jonathan's broader goal of leaving the world a better place. Rebecca Lane became the face of the airline's transformation. Once known only as the flight attendant who had clashed with Jonathan, she now embodied the company's new direction. Her story resonated deeply with employees and customers alike, a story of redemption, growth, and the power of second chances. One day, during a leadership workshop she was hosting, a young flight attendant asked her, "Miss Lane, weren't you afraid when you were called to Mr. Harris's office? How did you turn things around?" Rebecca smiled, remembering the mix of fear and determination she had felt that day. I was terrified, she admitted, but Mr. Harris didn't see me as a failure. He saw me as someone who could do better. That belief changed everything. And now it's my turn to pass that belief on to you. Her words became a cornerstone of the company's culture. Everyone deserves the chance to grow. For Jonathan, the airline's success was deeply satisfying, but something even more profound had begun to take shape within him. The decision to offer Rebecca a second chance had been a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for him. It forced him to confront the kind of leader he wanted to be. One evening, as Jonathan sat alone in his office, Gregory walked in, holding a glass of whiskey. "You've been quiet lately," Gregory said, handing him the glass. "What's on your mind?" Jonathan swirled the amber liquid thoughtfully. "Do you remember when I told you this takeover was about sending a message?" Gregory nodded. "Hard to forget. You wanted to prove a point." Jonathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "It started that way, but now it feels like the point I was trying to prove wasn't to the world, it was to myself." Gregory raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Jonathan leaned back, his gaze distant. "For years, I thought power was about control, about making people respect you whether they wanted to or not. But Rebecca, she taught me something different. Power isn't about forcing respect, it's about earning it. And the only way to earn it is by lifting others up." Gregory smiled, lifting his glass. "Well, here's to growth. I have to say, I liked you better when you were just ruthless." Jonathan laughed, clinking his glass with Gregory's. "And I like me better now." Months later, Jonathan found himself at the airport, watching passengers board a flight. The terminal was bustling, but for Jonathan it was a peaceful moment. He spotted Rebecca among the crew, her demeanor confident and professional as she helped passengers settle in. Their eyes met, and Rebecca gave him a small, knowing smile. Jonathan nodded in return, his heart swelling with pride, not just for her, but for the culture they had built together. He turned to leave, but before he could, a passenger approached him. "Excuse me," the man said hesitantly. "You're Jonathan Harris, aren't you?" Jonathan smiled politely. "Yes, I am." The man extended a hand. "I just wanted to say thank you. I've been flying with this airline for years, and I've never seen it like this. Whatever you've done, it's working." Jonathan shook the man's hand, his smile growing. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means more than you know." As he walked away, Jonathan felt a quiet sense of triumph. He had set out to make a point, but instead he had found something far greater: purpose. The airline's success wasn't just about numbers or accolades, it was about people, and in helping them find their worth, he had rediscovered his own. The airline, once struggling, became a beacon of innovation and humanity in the industry. Jonathan's leadership inspired others to rethink what it meant to lead, and his story of transformation, redemption, and second chances became a legend. For Jonathan, it wasn't the accolades or the profits that mattered. It was the knowledge that he had built something meaningful, something that would endure long after he was gone. And as he looked out at the bustling terminal one last time, he knew he had found the answer to a question he hadn't even realized he was asking. What does success truly mean? For Jonathan Harris, the answer was clear. Success wasn't about winning. It was about lifting others to new heights,